He thought he was saving the dog. He was wrong. The storm came in off Georgian Bay sometime after midnight, and by the time Calloway heard the sound, the snow was already halfway up the fence posts along the back of the property. He almost didn't go outside. He was in that place he sometimes went after a glass of rye and an hour of staring at the wall. Not sleeping, not quite awake, just somewhere between the two where the memories couldn't quite find him. Then the sound came again. High and thin, barely carrying over the wind. He pulled on his boots without lacing them. The dog was in the shed behind the vacant house at the end of Perch Lake Road, a place that had sat empty for 3 winters since old Clifford Mace had gone into the home in Penetanguishene. The shed door was held shut with a rusted padlock, and someone had jammed a length of 2x4 through the handle for good measure. Calloway didn't think about it too hard. He picked up a rock the size of his fist from the frozen ground, broke the padlock on the second swing, and pulled the door open. The smell hit him first, cold and animal, and something else, something sour with fear. The dog was in the back corner, pressed so hard against the wall that Calloway could see the pink of the insulation through the broken boards beside her. She was a Labrador mix, black as the space between the stars, and she was shaking hard enough that he could hear it. Not shivering, shaking. He stood in the doorway for a long time without moving. Then he sat down on the floor of that frozen shed in the middle of a January storm, and he waited. It took 11 minutes. He counted. Later he would think that 11 minutes was nothing. 11 minutes was the time it took to brew a pot of coffee, to drive from his place to the gas station in town, to get through the hold music at the VA clinic in Barrie. 11 minutes was nothing, but sitting on that floor with the wind screaming through the gaps in the boards, and the dog watching him with those white-rimmed eyes, 11 minutes felt like something he'd earned. She crawled to him on her belly. He carried her home under his coat. His name was Calloway. Dex Calloway was what it said on his discharge papers, though nobody had called him Dex since his mother, and she had been gone 8 years now. Around Elmvale they just called him Calloway, if they called him anything. He had moved back to the township after 22 years away, bought the acreage on Perch Lake Road for less than he expected, and had not, in the 2 years since, made much of an effort to announce himself. He was 53. He moved like a man who had learned a long time ago to take up as little space as possible. The Navy had taken him at 19 and kept him through 4 deployment cycles. 2 wars that had official names and 3 that didn't, and 1 night in a compound outside of Kandahar that he did not discuss and rarely thought about directly, the way you don't look straight at the sun. He had been part of Kansofcom long enough to understand that the unit he served with existed, in official language as a specialized maritime force, and in real language as something the government preferred not to think about between elections. He came home with a knee that ached in the cold and a tendency to wake up at 3 in the morning and stand at the window for an hour, checking things that didn't need checking. The knee he could work around. The 3 in the morning was harder. His wife Joanna had stayed through 2 of the deployments and gone quiet after the 3rd. She had not left him. She had simply become a version of herself that no longer quite occupied the same space. They lived lightly together for 4 more years, which was, Calloway sometimes thought, its own kind of war. When she finally moved to her sister's place in Barrie, neither of them cried, which felt like the saddest part of all. She called every few months. He picked up sometimes. The dog changed the geometry of his house from the first morning. He put her on the kitchen floor with a bowl of warm water and a piece of bread. It was all he had that seemed appropriate, and she drank the water slowly and then put her chin on his foot. He looked down at her. She looked up at him. She had amber eyes, which he hadn't noticed in the dark of the shed, and one ear that folded over at the tip like it had made a decision and stuck with it. He drove her to the vet in Midland 2 days later, once the roads were passable. Dr. Teresa Mack ran her hands along the dog's ribs and spine, with the careful efficiency of someone who had seen a lot of things come through the door and had stopped being surprised by most of them. She said the dog was somewhere between 3 and 5 years old, underweight but not critically, no microchip, no spinal damage despite what the cold had done. She had probably been in the shed for less than a week. She was going to be okay. "Does she have a name?" Dr. Mack asked. Calloway looked at the dog, who was sitting on the examination table looking at him with those amber eyes. "Not yet," he said. He drove home thinking about it. He passed the water tower on the edge of town, the Legion Hall, with its faded poppy wreath still on the door from November. The turnoff to the snowmobile trail, where he sometimes walked in the mornings when the insomnia was bad. He thought about his mother, who had named everything, her houseplants, her car, the aging tractor his father had left rusting in the field. He thought about the dogs he had worked with overseas, the Belgian Malinois, who had been with his unit for 3 years, and whose real name he had never learned because they called her by her handler's name, the way you do. He thought about that last morning in Kandahar, which he was not going to think about. By the time he turned off Perch Lake Road and saw the smoke from his chimney catching the wind, he had decided. "Bram," he said out loud, into the empty cab of the truck. He didn't know where it came from. It felt right the way some things do. Not because you chose them, but because they chose you. The dog in the back seat lifted her head. Bram did not bark for the first 3 weeks. Calloway noticed this, the way he noticed most things. Quietly, without making a thing of it. She was not mute. He could hear the occasional low sound in her throat, something between a hum and a whimper, when she was dreaming. But she did not bark at the crows that landed on the fence. She did not bark at the snowplow that came down Perch Lake Road every Tuesday morning before dawn. She did not bark when the woman from 3 lots over, a retired schoolteacher named Gwen Pritchard, came to the door one afternoon with a loaf of banana bread and a look of barely concealed curiosity. "I heard you found a dog," Gwen said. "Heard from who?" "This is a small township, Calloway." He held the door open. Gwen stepped inside and looked at Bram, who was sitting in the middle of the kitchen floor watching the whole thing with her ears up. "She's beautiful," Gwen said. "She doesn't bark. Maybe she just hasn't found anything worth barking at yet." He thought about that after Gwen left. He ate 2 slices of the banana bread standing over the sink, which was how he ate most things, and he looked at Bram, who had followed him into the kitchen, and was now lying with her chin on her paws, watching. The thing about silence was that Calloway understood it. He had been silent in ways that most people never needed to be. The silence of a hide position at 3. In the morning, the silence of holding your breath while something moved in the dark 20 meters away. The silence you kept because the wrong sound could end everything. He had carried that silence home with him, like gear he forgot to unpack. It sat in his chest, a weight he had stopped noticing the way you stop noticing the hum of the refrigerator. Bram's silence was different. Hers was a held thing, a caution. She watched everything before she committed to anything. She learned his routines in those first weeks, with a precision that occasionally unsettled him. She knew the difference between the coat he wore to the woodshed and the coat he wore when he was going into town, and she responded differently to each. She knew that 3 in the morning meant he would be standing at the window, and she started getting up to stand beside him. He didn't tell her to, she just did it. The first bark happened on a Thursday morning in the 3rd week, and it was directed at a squirrel that had gotten into the bird. Feeder Gwen had sent over as a follow-up gift. It was not a particularly impressive bark, half-hearted, almost experimental, like she was testing the equipment, but she looked at Calloway immediately after she did it, and he had the distinct and disorienting sense that she was checking his reaction. "Good," he said. She wagged her tail. Once, the town of Elmvale held its winter farmers' market on the 2nd Saturday of the month in the arena lobby, and Calloway had been avoiding it since he moved back, because the arena lobby was small and loud, and full of people who wanted to know things about him. But Gwen mentioned it twice, and then mentioned it a 3rd time, while looking at Bram with the particular expression of someone who knows the argument is already won. He took Bram on a Saturday in late February, when the temperature had climbed to a reasonable -7, and the roads were mostly clear. It went sideways almost immediately, not badly, just differently than he planned. The problem was Bram. She walked at his heel through the door and then stopped, took in the whole scene. The tables of preserves and woodwork and winter squash, the kids running between the legs of their parents, the smell of coffee from the concession stand. And then she did something Calloway had not seen her do yet. She sat down, looked up at him, and wagged her tail like she was being told very good news. He let her lead. This turned out to mean working a slow circuit of every table in the place, accepting pets from approximately 45 different people, eating a piece of cheddar cheese that an elderly man named Ernest Brule pressed on her, with the gravity of a man offering something sacred, and sitting quietly beside a little girl in a purple coat who was crying about something to do with a dropped muffin until the girl stopped crying and started petting Bram's ears instead. Calloway stood with his hands in his pockets and watched. A man came to stand beside him. Calloway had seen him around, mid-50s, rangy, with the look of someone who had spent serious time outdoors. He introduced himself as Pete Moreau, said he ran the machine shop on the highway, and then said nothing for a comfortable stretch while they both watched Bram continue her rounds. "She's got a gift," Pete said finally. "She walks into a room and people settle." Calloway agreed because it was true and he had been thinking it for 20 minutes. "My son's like that. Never knew what to do with it when he was young." Calloway looked at him. "He's a paramedic now," Pete said. "Works out of Barrie." He paused. "Some people are just built to walk into hard situations and make them easier. I figure that's a thing that's worth having in the world." They stood there a while longer. Bram came back eventually, leaned against Calloway's leg, and looked up at both of them with an expression of great satisfaction. The bad night came in March. Calloway knew it was coming the way he always knew. The particular quality of the quiet in the house, the way the cold felt inside rather than outside, the fact that he couldn't get through half a page of the book he was reading without the words rearranging themselves into other words. He put the book down and sat in the kitchen with a glass of water and tried to do what the counselor in Barrie had taught him, which was to name 3 things he could see and 3 things he could hear and work his way backward from there. He could see the table, the window, the dark. He couldn't get past the dark. Kandahar came back the way it did, not as a scene, not as something with a beginning and middle and end, but as a quality of experience. The specific texture of knowing that something had gone wrong before you fully understood what it was. The weight of the rifle, the sound of Corporal Desjardins, who had been 24 years old and from a small town in New Brunswick, and who had wanted to be a high school geography teacher, saying one single word that Calloway would hear for the rest of his life. He was shaking. He recognized this as a thing that happened and tried to be neutral about it. Then Bram put her chin on his knee. She had gotten up from her spot by the wood stove. He hadn't heard her move, and she was standing beside him now with her chin on his knee, and her amber eyes looking up at him with an attention that felt, in that moment, like the most seriousest thing in the world. Not pity, not alarm, just presence, just, "I see you and I am here and we are going to stay here until it passes." He put his hand on her head. They stayed like that for a long time. At some point the shaking stopped. He didn't notice exactly when. The kitchen came back into focus, the table, the window, the wood stove clicking in the corner. Bram didn't move until he lifted his hand, and then she went back to her spot by the stove and lay down, circled once, and closed her eyes. He sat there looking at her. He thought, "I did not know that I needed something to come home to." He thought, "She was in that shed for less than a week, and I still cannot explain what would have happened to both of us if I hadn't heard her." Gwen Pritchard organized the thing. She would later insist it hadn't been organized, that it simply happened, the way things did in small communities. But Calloway noticed that it happened on a Saturday in April when the snow was off the ground, and 4 different people arrived at the same time with food, so he gave Gwen the credit she was pretending not to want. Pete Moreau was there, and his wife, a compact and direct woman named Suzanne, who ran the library outreach program out of the back of a van 2 days a week. There was Ernest Brule, who turned out to be 91 years old and sharp as January ice, and who had served with the Royal Canadian Regiment in Cyprus in 1974 and had strong opinions about most things. There was a young couple from down the road, Jonah and Caitlin Faber, who had moved up from Mississauga 2 years ago to run an egg operation and were still figuring out how the township worked. There was Dr. Mack, who had driven over from Midland for reasons she described as professional interest in a patient, and which Calloway understood were different from that. Bram moved through all of them with the ease of someone conducting an inspection she already knew the outcome of. They ate on the porch because the afternoon had turned warm enough for it. the particular warmth of an Ontario April that still carries winter at the edges but lets you forget about it for a few hours. Ernest told a story about Cyprus that went on longer than it should have and was worth every minute. Jonah talked about the egg operation with the enthusiasm of someone in love with a problem he hasn't solved yet. Suzanne said something to Calloway quietly, when they were both standing at the railing looking at the tree line, that he thought about for a long time afterward. She said, "You seem different than when you first came back." He said, "I've been back 2 years." She said, "I know. You seem different than last fall." He didn't argue with this. He looked at Bram, who was lying in a square of late sunlight on the porch boards, with Ernest's hand resting on her back, and Ernest was talking and laughing at his own story. And the hand was resting on Bram the way you rest your hand on something solid when you're navigating uncertain ground. She'd changed the math, he said. It was the only way he knew how to put it. Suzanne nodded like she understood exactly. The summer brought more of the farmers' market Saturdays, more conversations with Pete that started about machines and ended somewhere else. More mornings on the Perch Lake Trail, with Bram moving ahead of him through the damp grass, turning back every so often to check that he was still there. She had started doing this, the checking back. Every 30 seconds or so on a walk, she'd turn her head, confirm he was behind her, and carry on. He had read somewhere that dogs do this as a way of maintaining the integrity of the group, of keeping the pack coherent. He understood this in his bones. In the unit you did it differently, but for the same reason: a glance, a signal, a frequency on the radio. Still here, still here, still here. She barked now with the full confidence of a dog who had decided the world was worth addressing. She barked at the fox that had been working along the fence line. She barked once at Gwen's car, then stopped when Gwen got out, as though she had registered the error and wanted to be clear she wasn't making it up again. She barked on the mornings when Calloway slept too long, past 6, usually, which was apparently her limit, a single deliberate bark from the foot of the stairs like a knock on a door. "You were going to sleep till noon. I have decided otherwise." He started sleeping better. He noticed this the way you notice the absence of something you've been carrying for so long you stopped registering the weight. In August he drove down to Barrie and had a long overdue appointment at the clinic. The counselor, a patient man named Dr. Al-Farouk, who had been seeing Calloway on and off for 3 years and had learned not to push the parts that weren't ready to move, said something that Calloway turned over on the drive home. He said, "You seem like you've found an anchor." Calloway thought about Bram on the porch with Ernest. Bram at 3 in the morning standing beside him at the window. Bram's chin on his knee. "I think maybe she found me," he said. In September, a thing happened at the farmers' market that Calloway later described to Dr. Al-Farouk, haltingly, as the part he hadn't expected. A woman named Cécile Boudreau was there with her son, a boy of about 9 named Mathieu, who would not let go of her hand and would not look at anyone, and who stood with his whole body turned slightly away from the room, the way children do when they're trying to become smaller than they are. Calloway didn't know the story. He didn't ask. He just noticed, the way he noticed things. Bram noticed first. She pulled the leash, gently, which was unusual, in the direction of the boy. Calloway let her lead. She stopped about 2 feet from Mathieu, sat down and waited. She didn't push. She didn't perform. She just sat there with her amber eyes on the boy, and her tail moving in a slow, patient sweep. The boy looked at her sideways. Bram waited. Mathieu looked at his mother. His mother gave him the small nod that means it's okay. He reached out his hand, very slowly, and Bram leaned forward and put her nose in his palm. Calloway watched the boy's face change. Not in a dramatic way, just the particular easing of something that had been held tight for a long time. Cécile looked at Calloway across the top of her son's head. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He nodded. She nodded. Mathieu sat down on the floor of the arena lobby, and Bram put her head in his lap, and that was that. By the time the leaves came down, Perch Lake Road had a different texture than it had the January before. Gwen came over on Tuesdays for coffee, which had started as an occasional thing and become something else. Pete and Suzanne had them for dinner in October, and the evening ran long in the way evenings run, when nobody wants to be the first to say it's time to go. Ernest called sometimes. Actually called on the phone, because Ernest regarded texting as a personal affront, and the conversations were long and ranged widely, and always seemed to end up somewhere neither of them had expected. Calloway shoveled Gwen's walk when the first snow came. She left a container of soup on his porch the next day. He didn't mention it, neither did she. This was, he had come to understand how the township worked. You showed up, you didn't make speeches about it. Bram was the reason for most of it. He knew this and didn't mind. She had walked into every awkward introduction and held silence and prickly mourning, and been simply, steadily herself. And people had opened the way people do when something honest is in the room. He thought about her in the shed, sometimes, in the way he found himself now able to think about hard things, without the thinking becoming the thing itself. Someone had put her in there. Someone had decided that she wasn't worth keeping and left her in the cold. He had filed a report with the OPP back in February. Nothing had come of it, which didn't surprise him. What surprised him when he let himself think about it was the path of it. The storm that had brought him to that shed on that night. The sound she'd made, high and thin, that had pulled him up from the chair. The 11 minutes of sitting on the frozen floor while she decided whether he was safe. She had been deciding that she was willing to trust. He had not understood, in January, that he was deciding the same thing. The photograph was Caitlin Faber's idea. She had started documenting the township for a project she was putting together about rural community. A quiet, ongoing thing she didn't make much noise about. She asked in October if she could take a picture of Calloway and Bram on the porch, and he said yes without particularly knowing why. He stood on the porch in the late afternoon light, his hand on Bram's back, and looked at whatever Caitlin was looking at through the lens. The sugar maple at the edge of the yard had gone full red. The lake was gunmetal under the October sky. Bram sat very still with her ears up, which was how she looked when she was paying careful attention to something she took seriously. He thought about Joanna, which he could do now in a way that didn't close his chest. Just a thought, clear and a little sad, and with room around it, the way things are when you've let them be what they are. He thought about Desjardins, which was harder, but he thought it anyway. He thought about the unit, the years of it, the things it had made him good at, and the things it had cost him, and the question he'd been working on, slowly, without pushing, of whether those two things could live in the same life. Caitlin took the picture. Bram turned and looked up at him with those amber eyes. He scratched behind her ear, the one that folded over at the tip. Yeah, he said. It was not quite an answer. It was not quite a question. It was the kind of thing you say when something has become true that you hadn't planned on, and you want to acknowledge it, without making too much of it. Because making too much of things was never the way. She wagged her tail. Later, in the longer evenings of November when the dark came early and the wood stove worked hard, he would sometimes try to explain it to himself, what the year had been. He had found a dog in a shed in a storm. He had sat on a frozen floor for 11 minutes. She had crawled to him. Everything after that had simply been the consequence of that particular thing, which was two beings in a cold place, each of them deciding at the same time that trust was still possible, that you could still reach toward something, that the world, despite everything it had taken, still held the possibility of warmth. He thought about what Pete's son did for a living, walking into hard situations and making them easier. He thought about Ernest's hand on Bram's back, about Matthew sitting on the floor of the arena lobby, the careful way he'd reached out his hand. The world was full of beings looking for the same thing, a sign, however small, that it was safe to come out, that someone had sat down on the floor to wait. Bram was lying by the stove, twitching in her sleep, running through something only she could see. Outside, the first real snow of the season was beginning to fall. Calloway sat with his coffee and watched her, and he thought, I did not know I was lost. I only knew it when she found me.